Coach Robb podcast, answering questions and eliminating frustrations about health, wellness, and performance since 1987.
Well, welcome to the Coach Robb podcast. I am extremely excited that you guys have joined us for yet another show. We're excited to bring a new format to the Coach Robb podcast. Toolman Dan right now is actually finishing up a project, but I've got a very important guest with us. And for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. And before we do so, I just want to let you guys know our second podcast of every month is going to be bringing in a guest moving forward. This week, I'm extremely honored to bring in Dr. Scott Branney. And if you guys have been around my platform for any period of time, Dr. Briny is my go-to guy for everything, whether it's injuries or whether it's blood work, fatigue-related diseases, just anything and everything under the sun. I'm extremely proud to say that I've had the privilege of working both with Scott and his son, Matt, who's a very, very accomplished downhill mountain bike racer. Now in the firefighter world, now moving into the medical world, kind of following in the footsteps of his dad. But before we get started, I'm not even going to give this man a chance to even say a word. I want to give you a little bit of background on this legend, and he's very humble and he'll dismiss this, but I am going to have to read off my notes here because there's quite a bit of it, so please be patient. But I'd like to welcome Dr. Scott Branney, attending physician of the emergency department of the St. Anthony's Hospital in Colorado. He's the medical director of the area ski patrol, EMS, and a majority of the fire departments in the area. He's got over 25 years. He doesn't look it as a practicing physician. This one blows my mind. Current chairman of the Colorado of Whole Blood Coalition, which I want a little more clarification on that. Published in numerous medical journals all around the world, is a national presenter on trauma and emergency medicine. He's won numerous awards for his work within all of these fields. As I said to you, he's a proud father of two sons, beautiful wife, great family all the way around. And as I said, he's been my go-to guy for, I'm going to show my age here, but for over 17 years. I always say that his son Matt and my sons Josh and Caleb, they're getting older, but we are not. And what's pretty interesting about this is when you look at this gentleman, not only is he smart, but he's also a complete badass on a mountain bike. Comes from a drag racing background, so don't ever challenge him to a drag race off of a red light with his. I was going to say, do you still have your Porsche Cayenne
I do
SUV?
Cayenne. I got a Hellcat, so
Okay, you got the Hellcat now.
there's still a Hemi in the garage.
There you go. So I apologize, guys. I didn't give Scott a chance to say a word because if I didn't get these accolades in, he would find some way to divert the conversation because he's extremely humble. He doesn't like to talk about his accomplishments, but this guy's busier than a one-armed paper hanger. So Dr. Brany, first and foremost, welcome to our first show, bringing guests onto the Coach Robb podcast. The one thing that I've purposely failed to mention is that you're the backbone of our complete med solutions and our blood evaluation. So anybody who has already gone through the process, you now can put a face with the name. And anybody who decides to utilize our services, and Scott and I will talk a little bit about it today. We've got some new things coming down the line as we look to expand those blood medical services. But Scott, again, thank you so much for being with us. It's an absolute honor. I do appreciate you taking time off. I know you don't get a lot of it. So for you to share some of your thoughts and backgrounds, I deeply appreciate it. Now I'm going to shut my mouth. How the heck are you doing, bud?
I'm doing great. I'm actually amazed you tracked down my background information, but that's all good. My honor to be here. As Rob said, we've worked together for years on years, whether on individual projects with people or on a bigger scale. And it's my pleasure to come and talk on some of the stuff we've got going, some of the background. Hopefully, fill some people in on how I can't quite do the little country doctor from Colorado, but probably try and stick to it. But some of those issues I think have some good direction we can share with some of the people out there and get a feel for where there's some benefit, where we're coming from, how this fits in, interestingly, what you do and what we've found in the overlap between your sports physiology and my more medical and trauma physiology, particularly, there's actually a whole lot of overlap that I don't think people give credit, are aware of. Is probably the best way to look at it.
Absolutely. And along that thread of thought, this is not a one and done type of podcast together. Depending on the questions that you guys send in. And as always, please feel free to utilize that contact@coachrob.com. We don't have the ability yet to do it as a live show where you guys could actually send us the questions while we're in here and give you a chance to bounce any ideas and questions off of Doc. But please feel free to send those emails in as you always do. And depending on Doc's schedule in the future, we'll try to get them back, and we'll address all of your questions. And that's the whole platform here, as we call it the People's Podcast for a reason. But I do have to back the train up just a smidge, Doc, if you don't mind. What is the Whole Blood Coalition? That's kind of intriguing title of a association.
It is, and it's one. This is something actually for you in Florida is actually mirrors what is actually started kind of nationwide. We know that when we address trauma patients, they don't do well if they're, our largest cause of people dying, which has some, obviously for our active population here, your biggest risk before age 46 is bleeding to death from something. Whether that's motor vehicle accident, personal trauma, however it comes. And we know as a system, particularly within the United States, we do very poorly at this. I actually got sucked into it that way back when there was a ABC correspondent over covering the Iraq War. And his neurosurgeon was from University of Chicago, an absolute hotshot. So when this guy got injured, he had a horrible brain injury, multiple foreign bodies in his head. And the surgeon said that this guy would have had no chance to survive in the United States, but because he was 3 miles from a field hospital in Iraq, he could actually walk home. And he did. He went, saw his family, but it's a little bit like, wait a minute, this can't be true. We have a tremendous medical system. I've been involved in trauma medical care since 1988. And with this, it's hard to believe that the odds would be so much better. So we start making a long, I can get going on this.
No, this is good. This is good.
We have actually formed, Colorado is going to be one of the first states to implement a statewide system where when you think of the ambulance showing up and they have a bag of saline,
yes,
we know that saline doesn't work and is actually harmful. And we're going to replace all that with blood.
Wow. Okay.
So a modest undertaking, but it's basically the military's derived all the tools. We're just trying to apply it in a civilian environment. And so within Colorado, we formed a coalition. We've got about 150 members of fire departments, hospital people, blood bank people, government people, all working towards trying to basically make whole blood available to those who need it from a trauma standpoint.
Okay.
In the field. And so, yeah, just a little side project to add.
Side project. Now, when you mentioned, you kind of alluded to Florida, is there something starting up here in Florida?
Florida, the Florida Whole Blood Coalition is actually one of the earliest groups to adopt this.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if there's any in Orlando for sure. I know there's a lot further south. I think when you get down closer, Miami-Dade and Broward and kind of down that way, there's they've been involved with this for a long time. So there's about 10% of the emergency department agencies across the country are doing it, but it's definitely, this will be something everybody will hear about from a trauma standpoint, probably within the next 5 to 6 years. We're just kind of on a little closer to the front edge of it.
No, that's awesome. Well, and congratulations on spearheading that there, and
Thanks.
Obviously chairing that is, something else to add to your to-do list. Yeah. The very first time I had a chance to fly out to Colorado and meet yourself and your bride, and then to be able to meet your boys and everything, one of the things that always amazes me is your passion about just sports in general. For those of you that follow us in the moto environment, Scott's got an extensive enthusiasm towards that at Thunder Valley. For those of you that follow us on the triathlon side of things, Doc's got an extensive background with endurance athletes and does a lot of research. And like I said earlier, is a huge go-to for me, especially when it's coming to splitting hairs on things where there might be some some animosity online because everything's everything's polarizing when it comes to a concept. And that's what I love about you, Doc, is let's just kind of stick to the physiology, the science, what motivated you and where you're at now. It's easy to see where you're at, but if we were to go back to when you first had that fire in the belly, what epiphany did you have that wanted you to, I see the passion now, and it's not like you just started 4 years ago and you're kind of the wet behind the ears guy where you're just like, yeah, I'm going to go change the world. What was the catalyst for that fire in the belly?
Well, it's a good question. And for a lot of it, to be honest, like many other people, I probably started just as an adrenaline junkie. I hate to say my entrance into medicine was the first time I was riding in an ambulance in downtown Denver at 85 miles an hour through traffic. And then and obviously Denver has a reasonable knife and gun club. So I was exposed to a lot of trauma. And there's so many pieces of advice I wish I'd listened to in my life. But at some point when I was at that stage, there were a bunch of my cohorts who I was hanging out doing this with, who were all like, we're getting out of here. This is a young man's game. We're going to med school. We're going to be an attorney. We got a couple CPAs. It was a bright group, but they all were like, they all had passion. They all had the intelligence. They all just went, it was like, we can't do this forever. And then I was very fortunate, as with many other good centers across the country. It's not unique to Denver, but Denver is privileged to have a very high quality level of trauma care.
Okay.
And I was fortunate to get in line with people who understood trauma, not just only from the adrenaline, the nuts and bolts, how fast can you make things happen, but really focused on the physiology of what's going on. Why is this happening? Is what you're doing harmful or is it beneficial? And it's an interesting link to what we've grown to with what we do.
Yeah.
In that when you really cut to it, the physiology is all the same. It's actually amazing that if I look at the same language and same physiologic concepts we use to describe severe trauma patients are the exact same we use in training.
Oh, okay.
Any of the other processes that when we get to overtraining, I mean, a topic you and I spend a great deal of time on, as people take this too far, we see the same thing in terms of rehabilitation. We see this 14 days out after a major auto accident. We see a lot of the same processes. So I think that was a lot of it was realizing that, kind of as you hit on already, the physiology doesn't change. It's underlying, it's not quite gravity as a rule, but it's pretty close. And with that, as we start looking at this, all of this is just a spin-off on there, on the underlying physiology. And that's always been a link when you start to realize that the same signal that is going to help me train is the exact same thing I see, just on a bigger scale, if I'm sliding into hemorrhagic shock after being shot. It's just a matter of how much rather than a matter of a different process. And so that got really intriguing when you realize that, wait a minute, as you know, Rob can attest, I tend to geek out on a few things, particularly this topic we're on now. And so we were starting to look at athletically, how do you get the most bang for the buck? If you're looking to be a 1%er or even less, smaller percentages than that, how do you get somebody to that? That tied in easily. So it's a funny link, but it's still, even with what I'm doing now, oxygen debt is one of the single biggest things I deal with on a whole blood concept, just as much as we deal with it from a training stimulus standpoint. So there's a lot of this that overlaps.
Now, you just said something that's pretty interesting. In your opinion, being in Colorado, with it being such a sophisticated trauma care, is that just because of the winter sports? Or I guess you really can't say winter sports because during the summer you've got beautiful things there like the downhill mountain biking and stuff like that. Is it just because of the mountains and the high level of outdoor activity?
Not really. It's a combination. We
Okay.
have a lot of active stuff, and certainly that I hate to say it is raw material, but every Sunday afternoon I know what's coming down the hill from the ski slopes, or in the winter,
Yep.
or following a major event, we have that. We have enough of an urban area. We've got about 3.5 million people packed into the Denver metro area. So reasonable kind of knife and gun club, interpersonal violence.
Okay.
lot of auto pedestrian, just a crowded environment.
Sure.
And then we were fortunate. There's many places this has happened again, but much actually same thing kind of in your world. You can think as you come, when all of a sudden you have your passion and you bump into somebody else who has that same passion, and you get regionally, we were fortunate with the medical community, especially in the late 80s through about 2000 of we had a very bright group and very motivated group, and some of the world's experts in this area just happened to be here. And the bar they set has held for years, but also it was great just to be by chance. If I'd been a different place, I might have had a different direction. But here, understanding the physiology, having a great experience in terms of things. And I think we're fortunate that the trauma system here is also a very team approach.
Okay.
They understand that the paramedic is just as important as the trauma surgeon, as the nurse,
Interesting.
as the doctor down the road, or,
Yeah.
it's very much the goal is a functional individual at the end, has allowed us to have people who actually listen to what goes on, even if it's not their piece of turf or their space. So the trauma surgeon listens to the emergency medicine director of, hey, if I don't do my part, your part doesn't work. And if you don't do your part, something else doesn't work. And it was just, we were fortunate, I think, in Colorado. That was one of the big drivings. One was more that systems approach to how it came to be.
Well, see, that makes a lot more sense to me because I know how you think after having the privilege of work with you for 17 years. The idea that everybody cross germinates and is willing to share information, that makes a lot more sense to me now. Versus you get very annoyed when people, I'm just going to kind of keep my cards close to my chest, or for just $29.99 around the corner, I'll solve your problem. That's never been your MO. In fact, it's kind of been one of your bones of contention. One of the things that I was curious about, and I appreciate you giving us that lead in for the sake of the listeners, because one of the things I was intrigued with, as most everybody that follows us knows, I had that heart attack back in September. You were, and I don't mind being public about it. You were really a thorn in my side. Things weren't tracking the right direction. And in all fairness, it went on for over a year, and I stubborn, whatever you want to call it. And then that final day on that Saturday, when I said, "Hey, look, I can't get through my warm up," and you're like, "Go get a cardiac. You need to go see a cardiologist." What I was surprised about, Doc, was I was in the hospital for 4 days, 3 nights, and my hospital bill was $152,000.
Yep.
And from your perspective, based on what you just said, the way that everybody in your area has a tendency to work with one another, if we could put you in a position where literally you controlled all the rules, regulations, everything associated with the medical, would there be one area, especially with what we do, is always trying to address the frustration of overtraining? You just shared with our listeners something that always has intrigued me when you said the similarities between a car accident and a certain time frame is exactly identical to overtraining symptoms. We just get there in a more roundabout way with overtraining. Could be 6 months, it could be 6 years, or it could be 12 days after a car accident or a ski accident. In your opinion, and this isn't to get into a political warfare, in your opinion, is there a way that we could do exactly what you're doing there in Colorado, where is it realistic to think that there could be more of an integration amongst medical professionals to help avoid, and even for those of our listeners that aren't or don't consider themselves highly athletic, we got a lot of moms, stay-at-home moms, dads, they're freaking exhausted. What would be your thoughts? Again, you have the magical wand. You get a chance to just touch the world in the medical and it all gets better. What would that be, in your opinion?
It would be nuclear to start with. I mean, so as I touch my magic wand, we have a number of, not a number, there are so many inefficiencies. There are so many small turfs.
Okay.
There are some of those that are governed by the way things are reimbursed. And with the default being that Medicaid reimbursement is what the insurance can base their stuff off of.
Gotcha.
So there's a lot, and we've discussed it at various points before. You have $150,000 bill. Well, that's because 85,000 of it is paying other people who aren't paying. You know what I mean? That your net, if we looked at what the value of what was given to you, but the hospital's going to go, we got to cover all this. We'll just tack it onto this.
Gotcha.
50% aren't going to pay, we'll charge the 60%.
Yep.
And whether that's right or wrong is a tough call,
Sure.
but with that, the two things I think that are the biggest thing is that there's very little attention to prevention. And we've
Yes.
discussed this before as well.
Yeah.
But when you look at prevention, they don't, it's much easier to be, you have high blood pressure, I get a prescription, I pay, the physician is paid to administer that prescription, instead of sitting down 10 years before there and going, hey, here's what we do that we don't even get there.
Mm,
Here's how we work through a plan for you that you avoid that in its entirety.
gotcha.
Very poorly reimbursed. It's very difficult in that it puts the onus on attention and follow-up rather than here's a one and done. You know what I mean?
Yes,
You
sir.
show up, it's like going to Jiffy Lube. Uh,
Hmm.
Many people and practices as well look at it in that same fashion. It's not just, it's the patient and the doctor. I want this fixed. I want it today. Boom, boom, I'm in and out, instead of, hey, let's start a relationship. Let's work towards something we can minimize these long-term costs. And that would be one of my magic wands.
Well, for those of you who are just checking in, we have the appearance of Mr. Toolman Dan. Welcome, Dan.
Hey.
Want to introduce you to Mr. Dr. Scott Branney, the man, the myth, and the legend. I told everybody when we started that you were finishing up a project and you'd be joining us. So thank you so much.
Yep, no problem.
And
Sorry I'm late.
no apologies at all. No, none at all. Like I told Doc, we appreciate the fact that he's carved out time for us and we try our best. But as I tease Doc, this is not how we get paid. So we do have other obligations. But one of the things, Doc, I'd be curious about is the way that you just kind of segue, or I guess surmise what you were just talking about. Is it realistic here myself? And I don't want to put words in Toolman Dan's mouth at all. It's easy for me, everyday citizen, going, hey, why doesn't the medical world work more in a proactive manner versus a reactionary? Dear friend of mine, Arden Ballard, had made a comment. We should call it sick care and not health care, because we do. And again, not to get into a bipolarization of the subject, is it strictly driven by money, or is there something lacking, from your opinion, from a physician standpoint, or from a medical, because you could take chiropractic with blood work to neurologist to,
Sure.
Is it realistic to even think that we could get to a point where we could do things more proactively? Again, in a perfect wand environment?
I think even beyond a perfect wand environment, there are pressures to kind of move things that way, but they're just not moving very quickly.
Okay.
And part of it is when you think, I'm going to date myself here, which is go back to the, choosing a med school in 1992. All of a sudden, then the vast majority of choices are the kind of the old traditional choices. Your medicine, your psychiatry, you're a surgeon.
Mm.
At that point, family practice or primary care was way down the ladder.
Okay.
Trying to make that switch of whether we have enough or not is always an argument, but we may have enough surgeons per se, but we know we don't have enough people doing primary care or that front loading, that health care rather than the sick care like you're talking.
Mm-hmm.
The other is you're sitting there as a second year med student, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, and you're starting to look at what people do and how they do it and what they get paid. And there's a lot of attraction to a lot of the more subspecialty specialized, I'm going to do this. And it also is compounded if you like that. I'm really fortunate in emergency medicine. There's in the sense that one of the things I get to take out of my equation is I don't have to decide what I like. I don't get a choice. There's
Gotcha.
many positives that offset that, but my choice is what's next on the list.
Okay.
And whether it's I've got a great trauma or whether it's, oh, I've got a chronic complaint that's been going on for 6 years, nobody's addressed, that's just part of my process. But when people are deciding, a lot of people decide this is what I like to do and I only want to do it. And it's tough to get people, I think, it's better. It's much better, and it's probably getting better each year.
Hmm.
I want to do the whole package. I want to do prevention. I want to do primary care in the sense of preventing this disease rather than just treating the consequences of it.
That makes
But
sense.
it, but it's a lot, it's way back compared to a lot of things.
Let me ask you this, and Dan, feel free to jump in with any questions that you have as well. But Dan is a vet rider. Dan
Yep.
has a young daughter. Dan has multiple hats, runs a couple different businesses. And what Dan and I talk quite a bit about is we have a group of people that we go and we ride moto with or mountain bike or in our triathlon market. We've got quite a few people that are 45 and above, and they're training for half Ironmans and Ironmans and 10Ks and marathons and all that. But we thankfully with our Coach Robb podcast, we have quite a few young parents. So I always get excited about that because I'm like, okay, and Dan and I talk a lot about this. If you could get a young parent, 40, 50 years old, and they've got a young child, when we look at a bookcase, right? You have the people that are recently born, getting into athletics, have no pre-existing issues. Ignorance is bliss. They're just, they have so much exuberance about everything. Then you have the other end of the spectrum where we've made some bad mistakes in our 20s and our 30s and 40s, and we're paying the price for that lack of mobility, bone on bone, torn cartilage. Maybe we overtrained because we thought more is better, kind of no pain, no gain. From your perspective, and I want to share this with it because we look at the demographics and we have quite a few people who fit right in that middle where we're excited that they've got this young group. Why? And Dan and I tease about this all the time. Why is that? And again, I'm only asking from your personal, you can be as politically incorrect as you want because that's what this show is all about, is just being honest with our listeners. Why such a resistance to recovery? Why such a resistance to the wearable goods that give you indicators? Now, granted, we're not saying they're 100% gospel. They're not, the absolutes, but I mean, at least it puts you in the ballpark.
Right.
Elevated heart rate, low body battery, poor HRV, suppressed appetite, night sweats. I mean, how many of these stacks? But from your perspective as a physician, why the resistance to recovery, especially when we could start getting this information to younger and younger generation? Why do they resist it as much as us?
No, understand. And the other one, when you talk about the old book with my broken down orthopedic structure, having worn out every joint I have. Uh,
Sure.
my take on this is largely that the problem with this is there's that fine line between I want to commit and I really want to commit.
Okay.
And we've both seen these more. It's easier when you get to an elite athlete. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
The sense of, yeah, you're comfortable being a 60%er, but if you want to take and get that other 25%, here's what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for a lot of people, they look at the easy part of the training bit. I'm going to go take an hour, and let's face it. I mean, both myself and Matt, I can look at a stack of weights and I gain weight.
Yes.
I don't even have to move it. But
Yes.
that thought of I went in, I came out 2% better. It's documented, it's easy. And I think one of the biggest disconnects in all of this, and this is something you taught me a long 17 years ago, I think, to be honest, is the concept that I don't get better while I'm training. I get better while I recover.
Mm-hmm.
That link is just lost. I think there's a tremendous disconnect of doesn't matter what the workload is.
Mm-hmm.
Until you pay it back and recover, you're not going to get any better. And this is one we see all the time. I told you about a little bit that link. One of the things I've had a lot of focus the last year or two is there's a lot of people who get into shock. And shock is basically just, I'm not delivering as much product as I'm using. I need more oxygen. I'm not delivering it. I go into oxygen debt.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing on the back half of a big moto. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Your body system can't deliver it. You're asking it to do more than it can. But the whole thing is how fast that recovers. And you can't just come back to neutral. You've got to come back and actually recover above whatever that baseline oxygen. I can deliver enough oxygen, but if I don't deliver more, I won't undo the damage that was done previously by being in oxygen debt.
Mm.
And that's where recovery comes in. And recovery in a medical sense, a little bit different. I've got you enough blood cells. I'm getting compounds out that need to be, the other issues, but the net process is the same.
Mm-hmm.
That gets lost, and it's easy to go, well, I went and trained, I did the work. It's like, no, no, no.
Yeah.
Sitting at the night with your feet propped up after doing an ice bath for 45 minutes, 10 minutes after you finished, that's the work, or just as much of the work.
Yes.
And,
I, I have
and
a
it's very difficult. Now I'm into I'm sorry, Dan, didn't mean to cut you off, sir.
No, I don't want to cut you off. I just had a quick question. As far as recovery goes, we're all different, right?
Yep.
Typically, younger folks recover quicker than the older guys. Like I notice myself, I don't recover as fast as I used to.
Yeah.
But medically, is there something like in blood tests or something like that that you can identify maybe where somebody is lacking a nutrient or deficiency in something that could be holding them back from recovering?
Every once in a while, and it's not that common, but it's also not to be missed. I think so we'll take some people who start to basically, it's worth a screen at some point just to make certain kidneys are okay, synthetic function's okay, your thyroid's doing what it's supposed to, just kind of that 30,000 foot view. But oftentimes we don't get a ton of bang for the buck out of that. Most of it, unfortunately, is chasing data after the fact. And by that, we start to get into this, okay, did I overreach and I just had a bad workout, or that dreaded, am I starting to overtrain? And then it gets easier to bring tools to bear. But it's really tough beforehand of let's say you're in the middle of a cycle, you got a big race coming up, or a goal race at some point, you're working towards it, everything's on rails. If everything's on rails, it's sometimes tough to sort out that the easy markers are all going to come back that they look okay. So I wish there was just a clear cut marker. We do know that for one of the things that this ties in, and we've talked a bit about before, is oftentimes your response to how your training is going gives us almost a big block of information just besides what's there physiologically. So when you see, how are you feeling? Hey, I've still got plenty of energy. I'm sleeping great. All my emotional markers are good. That oftentimes gives a good feel of that kind of, I hate to say mind body, but you know what I mean? That interface between how your training is going and how you perceive that it's going. We can actually kind of quantify to a small degree and get a feel that, hey, you seem a little bit more stressed about what's going on, even if your body hasn't started to show the signs of it's not keeping up or breaking down, something along those lines. But
Well,
that single marker is tough to get.
and what I think is interesting, Doc, is, and you and I have been doing a lot of work with the wearables, like the continuous glucose monitoring, the heart rate monitors. Obviously, we've got our complete med solutions looking at the blood on the inside out. And it was interesting the way that you just articulated it, because I think you exemplify what our listeners think. Well, if I go into this fluffy mind body thing, then I need to toughen up. No, no, no. Especially as you get what we refer to, and our listeners have heard Dan and I use this term quite a bit, athletic maturity.
Yep.
It is difficult when you're dealing with some of these young kids that are put into the catbird seat at 12 and 13, because they're still young people, much less mature athletes.
Right.
Where you get somebody that's 22 or 23, they've got that 10,000 hour stamp, they've got that accomplished. They can be a little bit more sensitive to the true link between the mental and the physical, and without being perceived as being soft. You're taking the low road or whatever. One thing that you said that I would be very curious on getting your feedback on, when you mentioned the idea, and again, this is strictly from your biased opinion, one of the things that we've shared with our listeners is the 4 pillars of success. Pillar number 1 is being prepared. So that would be rested, fed, and hydrated. And then when those 3 are in place, you can focus. That's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is becoming fit, and that would be strength, endurance. And we always say, well, you can't get to pillar 2 unless you're checking all the boxes in pillar 1. Then we go racing. Pillar number 3 is all about executing a strategy, inverse relationship between volume and intensity. And then the 4th and final pillar is that recovery, whether that's moto to moto, minute to minute, day to day, training block to training block. And yet it's none of them, of the 4 pillars, are ever separate, but they're always integrated together.
Yep.
From your opinion, and again, with your experience as an athlete yourself at a very high end, raising two boys that are very athletically talented, and then the plethora of people that you've seen and worked with, what is it, or rather, is there, you mentioned the idea that you've got some indicators that are some obvious and some not so obvious. Like for the one that I use that's not so obvious is, do you notice that your appetite's suppressed? Not emotional. There's no wearable that can help you understand that. And if you look at that and just let that be your baseline, yeah, we can go look at the other variables. But in your opinion, are there other things that people should be taking a look for, or not be afraid to look into it pretty hard, even though it may seem fluffy by mainstream?
Yeah, well, yes. And I think that the before I leave the pillar, you bring up a great topic. So this is backing up a half step.
Okay.
The problem with this is, for a lot of this, is pillar number 2. Because when people start to train, and particularly not the vet level, because by that point your athletic maturity is way up.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden it's, how do I cope with, I have less testosterone? How do I cope with, I have a family where I'm not getting the REM I need for adequate growth hormone release? You know what I mean?
Sure.
I've got life is kicking in, some of which is just getting old, as I can attest to. But when we look at that, one of the biggest problems I think we see when people start to train is they got this idea of what training is going to be. And they train what they're good at, not what they're bad at. Same thing happens to every paramedic I train. What are you good at? Don't care about that. What do you really suck at? What you are not good at? We'll go work on that piece. And then the other is understanding it, starting to integrate at that point what's going on. It's not the training, it's the recovery. And whether, like you said, moto to moto or over the long haul, if you want to be here, you can't, train continuously.
Yeah.
If I'm 22 and I'm dumping testosterone into my system by the gallon, I've got a fighting chance to get through that without too much damage. But as I start to pile up either training time or training age, or basically the combination of both, I'm going to start getting into trouble.
Yeah.
And that's particularly where I think some of these, whether we want to do them as wearables or adjuncts or whatever we're describing, has a lot of value. We already hit the question of whether some single blood testing, again, good screening.
Yeah.
The question of looking at heart rate monitor, everybody should have. I think that's just such simple data. We can get feedback from it on what we're doing from a cardiovascular standpoint. The issues, I think, when we get to sweat, and I got to qualify this one a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not like I'm Lance Arm. When Dr. Ferrari had his villa in Italy, he was really good at this stuff and was way, way out at the edge of what he was doing.
Yeah.
I live in a humble suburb in Colorado. I'm not quite that level of support. But with this, where we start looking, I think that the data that's available from those, even if it's to develop a plan, I'm not convinced for most athletes yet that, say, a wearable sweat content, or sweat analysis monitor needs to be on 24/7. But I am convinced that you should wear it and train. I did a dry race simulation. I did a cold race simulation. I did a humid one. I did a dry. So if I walk out and go, wow, it's 85 degrees today and my heat index is 110, this is roughly what I'm going to need to replace.
Yep.
The minute by minute, I don't know that a lot of people need the second by second adjustment through the race. Oh my gosh, I'm 3/4 of the way in. I'm 9 ounces down in terms of my electrolyte solution.
Yeah.
Not so convinced there. And I fall into the same, I think some of the same category looking at blood glucose.
Okay.
In that most athletes' glucose systems have a huge genetic component and are really efficient. We were reviewing blood work on somebody this last week who was another vet pro. Sorry to come hammering on the vets at the moment.
That's okay.
I've got an abnormal blood glucose value.
Abnormally high or abnormally low?
Yeah, his was just slightly high. He was the one,
Okay.
his H1C.
Okay.
So primary care doc looks at this and goes, oh my gosh, you're pre-diabetic. And I look at the same data and go, wow, what it means is you're unbelievably efficient at metabolizing boatloads of glucose. Your body doesn't care if it's a little bit high, because if you dump in 75 grams, it's going to go, it's into your muscle, everything's good. So there's some of those variables I think should be looked at and can have some contributing stuff, but not necessarily on the minute to minute.
Well, if I could interrupt you for just a brief moment, I think our listeners need to remember our conversation. When you eat an edible carbohydrate, I always use an apple as an example, and that gets converted to stored glycogen. Remember what we talked about in previous shows. Your body prefers stored glycogen as a more efficient fuel source than anything you dump into your belly. That's why that pre-nutrition is so vitally important. Snacking on fruits and vegetables that are high in vitamins, minerals, water, and electrolytes. Stack all that early, and try to come with your liver 100% gas tank full, muscle glycogen 100% full, and you'll be surprised how much easier it is to go fast. So, Doc, we have spoken about that. I just want to remind our listeners, because it's exactly what you've said, but you said it more more eloquently. Man, it's so important.
Huge. That one I can't. When we look, especially with the type of athletes, I'm thinking to largely listening. When we get our moto, we get our triathletes.
Yep.
You can't keep up that well during the event.
Yep.
You can minimize the amount of damage, but what you're trying to do is just getting stuff that's kicking a little bit more glycogen back in, or pulling a little bit of free glucose out, but you can't match the amount of fuel you need by doing it during the race. And the other one with that, it's another one of those training things. People who do need, if they start figuring, it's like, wow, I've got a 3.5 hour event, I got 4,000 calorie, whatever the numbers are in association with this.
Yep.
Better train on a full belly, so you get an idea what kind of shock that is to your GI tract.
Mm-hmm.
If you suddenly decide that I'm transitioning to the run and it's time for me to put down a bunch of glucose, GI tract may say, we can't absorb all that at the moment, thank you, which means it's going right out the other end.
Well, and let me interrupt you real quick, because for our listeners that follow us on the moto and the off-road world, and I have his permission to use this number or to convey his information. Most of you guys know who Mike Witowski is with Phoenix Honda. And in a 3-hour GNCC, our average calorie burn rate is 1,000 per hour. A little bit higher at Snowshoe, a little bit lower at Florida because of elevation change and things like that. So what Doc is saying, if we put it in quantification and you guys want to put a name and a sport, literally over 1,000 calories an hour being burned. And Doc, correct me if I'm wrong. I know there's some new research. Used to always say 300 is about your max. Then they're saying about 350. I still stick with that unless you have new research. But think about the deficiency. 1,000 calorie burn, you can only assimilate 350 on the high side. You've got this enormous gap. This is why we say to all of our listeners, it's imperative that you build an aerobic engine to become more efficient at the utilization of stored body fat for fuel, because that's where you're going to bridge that gap. Most all of our listeners know a gram of body fat yields 9 calories of energy. So when you're looking to convert what you have stored into energy, you get twice as much energy from a gram of fat. You need to become more fat efficient. That's why we do so much in the aerobic side. Just want to make sure, Doc, again, because you're dropping some major knowledge bombs here. And for people who have been following Toolman Dan and I for any period of time, go back and look at your notes when we talk about all these. This is Doc bringing kind of the medical approach to just validate that what you're doing is working. There's no doubt.
Also validates you two are way out in front of me, as you both know.
No, not even remotely close. We just have the privilege of doing these shows, and it's funny, Doc, because we're very big on making sure that our listeners are comfortable to send in questions, especially when they want things clarified. They're not being combative. Like Dan and I say, we want everybody to feel comfortable. You can disagree with us. You don't have to call us an asshole. Just tell us you disagree, and let's have an adult conversation as to why. But like in this case here, what I think is so interesting is, and I complain about this almost every show that we do, and I hope it doesn't come across as a complaint. I don't like it when they take physiological principles, spin them and distort them, and then try to make an agenda out of it.
Right.
That's where I have a problem with it. Doesn't matter if it's high intensity interval training, doesn't matter if it's keto, intermittent fasting. And I say it on every show. Certainly in a textbook format, I understand HIIT training. I get it.
Yep.
But what average individual has enough energy in their system and is coming in fresh enough to legitimately do that, particularly more than one consecutive day? I know that that's not proper English. You're
Yeah.
already exhausted. You push yourself through one, you damn sure shouldn't be coming back and doing 5 more days of it. But I
Yep.
get it. It's a cult. And I say cult, that's maybe not the right adjective. Everybody, like they love that. What's the word I'm looking for? Where we all want to be together, not a mob mentality. I'm drawing a
Herd of
mental, but
sheep.
yeah, it's that idea that I want to go suffer with a bunch of other people. So it
Yeah.
becomes, oh, my
Yeah.
tribe. That's the
Yeah.
word nowadays.
That's
Everybody's got their tribe, and
and,
I get it.
and the other one I think is important with all this, and we've alluded to this before, is you can still get results with poor training.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, you may not be doing it as easily, as healthy, better for the long run if you're trying to get somewhere. And then the other one is, if I need to get a 40% improvement and what I'm doing is only going to get me 30%, I'm coming somewhere back in the pack.
Yep.
And I see this a lot because I still come back to the number of times, and you hit it already, and I've hit it twice, the underestimation of how well aerobically trained people are.
Mm-hmm.
Most people's base is not as good as it should be before they make that next jump to, particularly if they're going to go to strength endurance or something that's going to start taxing that system hard. That, oh no, I've done my, I got my base work in, it's all good. Yeah, how good is it? Is it efficient? Does it actually work? If it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work, maybe you should go back and do some more. And it's very much kind of a pyramid thinking, I know, in terms of adding those next steps on.
Yes.
I think, and that's one of the things I think is tough as an athlete and tough as a unsupervised athlete is, well, I think I'm pretty good at it. It seems to be going well, but it's a number in your own head. There's no validation to it. And that's tough.
Yeah.
And I think that that is where a person needs to look in the mirror, right?
Yep.
And truly assess themselves, not to where they want to be or try to fit in with another group or try to look macho, right? You really need to look in the mirror and assess yourself and really see where you're at and be honest with yourself. Because I think you're right. I mean, I think it's just natural humans, right?
Yep.
We want to progress, right? But sometimes we progress too fast because we're just trying to fit in. And uh, one of the things that you said, we've talked about it, Coach Robb and I talk about all the time, is recovery, and you've hit on it multiple times here as well. The thing that I find interesting, right, is when you go on Instagram and you go on the internet and you see all these, these trainers and all these sports and stuff, they're grinding their athletes, right? But they never show the recovery part.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like, when these kids are watching these videos and they see these athletes just, dripping in sweat and they're just grinding in the gym, that's what they think that they have to do.
Yep.
But yet they don't know the full cycle of training and recovering. So they end up smoking themselves. And I wish that it was more transparent, right?
Yeah.
Of what
Yep.
the actual proper training program and recovery program is.
Yep.
And that's
Yeah.
why I think Coach Robb, so many people value Coach Robb because it is what is talked about. It's the full cycle.
Yep.
Well, and it's funny you say that, Dan, because I've been fired by Moto Dad saying that I hired you to bust my little kid's balls. And I said, well, besides the fact that his balls haven't dropped in yet, we won't talk about that right now. But yeah, that's exactly it. And
Right.
anybody that I've worked with knows, and Scott's son Matt can attest to it. I'm just a big believer that when you train, you've got to know where the zones are at. And you notice that I caught myself. I'm not going to say, and Doc, I would appreciate your feedback on this. I'm not against the idea that either training has to be easy or training has to be hard, whether you want to call that, they call it the polarized methodology and all these other different things that are out there. I look at it this way. You need to have accurate heart rate zones based on your current level of fitness and stress. That's why I think you should always factor in your 5-week moving resting heart rate average, because it's factoring in current levels of stress.
Yep.
So our heart rate zones are updated every 6 weeks at the most. We supersede the numbers that are in the watch. We got to respect all of these companies. They're trying to program devices and then sell them to everybody that's under the sun. So what we do to increase the accuracy of them is we do max heart rate assessments, sport specific. We use a 4-week, preferably a 5-week moving average. You've got your heart rate zones. The reason why I bring that up is a lot of times, and Doc said an interesting comment earlier that I've seen so many times, but I've never thought about it until you just said it. I've seen so many people that have come to me from other programs and they're like, yeah, Rob, we did, because they were working with the previous program. We did a lot of speed work. And then we look at the heart rate ranges and they never got the heart rate high enough on their speed days to engage anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold. And then on their easy days, their heart rate was too high. So now you've double whacked yourself because you went too hard on your easy days. You didn't go hard enough on your hard days. And then you wonder, to Doc's point, you got a little bit of improvement, but what the end result was after, say, 6 months was exhaustion.
Yeah.
And they're like, how the hell did that happen?
Right.
That's how it happens.
Absolutely. No, and I'm smiling and laughing because that's one of, I think, of the hallmarks of so many programs.
Yeah.
And this gets a little bit, I think, into the mental aspect of when you tell somebody that, hey, when we train hard, we're going to train really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to the point you may not have an idea what that is.
Yeah.
You know, I want to take you to 90%, and this individual, myself included, might hit 70 and go, I'm there. It's like, not even close yet. But the flip side, when recovery comes and it's like, nah, we don't, we want you, whatever. Let's say we're under 45%. That's much easier than you really think it's going to be.
Yes.
And so they spend way too much time in that middle zone. You don't get the improvement, but you add up enough workload over time that you start to damage yourself physiologically. We're saying the same thing, but it's just one of the great truths in this. And I think there's a role for all of these depending on how it fits your program.
Yeah.
And if you're in a program that says, yes, we're going to do some serious speed work. Yeah, 3% of the time, and your recovery is going to be 3 times as long before you do another one afterwards. As you might notice, I'm a pretty big boy. So from my standpoint, when you start looking, if we go to really heavy weight, a lot of that was, okay, I'm going to do it at an intensity. I can do it once a week. The people that go, I can do this every 2-3 days, like, or 3 days a week on an every other, like, not a chance.
Yeah.
You're not moving enough weight on the day you're actually doing it. And so if I was big, big squat, big deadlift, it's like, fine, that's it. I'm 6 days till my next routine of doing this exact same level of that load. Doesn't mean we don't do other things. Doesn't mean we don't do recovery, but it's the amount of effort has to be offset by proportionally longer recovery time. And then the other one, I think, with your stuff is that it also hits that recovery has to be active. I think the more you can get into, I'm not just not doing anything, but I have a plan, just as how I approached how I was going to train. If that plan incorporates how I'm going to recover, that's where you get the most bang for the buck.
Yep. What's funny, Doc, one of the things that's very interesting to me is we have a pretty large contingency of Ethiopian runners and Kenyan runners. And what I find so fascinating is if they're not sleeping, if they're not eating, they're literally laying on the ground. They have plenty of furniture in their house. They're making over $1 million a year running, right? They're laying on their back with their feet up on the wall, reading a book, letting gravity do its job. Now, they're not nothing against Normatec boots and all the other pneumatics that are out there, but they're like, hey, the most inexpensive way is let gravity work. We've already done our homework. We've eaten. We've gone and maybe done our morning run, mid-afternoon. We're not napped. They may have already taken a nap, which, by the way, they've already slept 10 or 12 hours. They've gotten their morning workout in, they've eaten. They may or may not have taken their nap yet, but they are sitting with their feet up on the wall. And here's something that I think is so fascinating. Now, I did not come up with this, so please don't misconstrue what I'm about to say. You talk to these Ethiopians, and Doc, you've met and worked with a lot more of them than I ever have or will. Their mindset is, my fast pace is going to be fast. So let's just use for even numbers of 4:30 pace per mile. Not unrealistic anymore for the marathon. Their easy pace, as a general rule of thumb, is always double what their fast pace is. So if they're running 4:30s, their easy runs are no faster than a 9-minute mile. And they've incorporated that for over 20 years.
And it works.
And who's the most dominant at the marathon? It's going to be from one of those two countries for probably the lion's share of all not only wins, but world records that are out there.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of the moto folks are going to be stunned, because when you said a 4-minute, 30-second mile,
Yep.
I'm like, my jaw's on the floor. Us moto people, we don't run that fast.
No, exactly. But like what Doc said,
Nobody runs that fast.
well, and Doc said this at the beginning of today's podcast, which I thought is so poignant. And that is, when he sees somebody in a car accident at a certain cadence, 7 days, 10 days, and then 14 days, he correlates that against overtraining symptoms. And what we were talking about, Dan, is the idea that you may have trained for a year for world vets at Mammoth and put yourself into the same state of trauma that somebody has from a car wreck, relatively speaking, in regards to how the body responds to it.
Yep.
Now think about that 430 mile. I couldn't run that if I was running from a cheetah, right? My legs just don't turn that fast. So to me, it's an inconceivable pace. But to think about the idea, and they put such an emphasis on rest and recovery. We, as an American running group, continue to get our ass served to us on a silver platter. And they're sitting there saying, this is what we do, which requires no sweat equity.
Right.
And yet we still won't adhere to it. It's
Us
just
ignorant
dumbfounding.
Americans.
Well, it's that idea that, and Doc knows my background. I've been at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And one of the most profound things that I ever heard somebody say was, and I share it with everybody all the time, it's not the work you do. That's not the definition of even overtraining. It's how much of the training can you absorb. And then the idea here was, when you're at the Olympic Training Center, they always say to us, we're not here to tell you what you want to hear. We're here to take the principles of physiology and leverage it. And the one that they always say is rest. They're more up our bonnet on rest than, are we running hard enough? Are we swimming hard enough? Are we cycling hard enough? Because anyone that's at that elite level, and even listeners that are dedicated to their own health and wellness, doesn't have to be somebody who's making a 7-figure salary on being fit. The principles still apply, and rest is the one that I get more pushback on. That's why I posed the question to Doc early in today's podcast is, from your perspective, from a medical perspective, why does a human being, we're told we're the smartest species on the face of the earth, why do we resist recovery?
Yeah.
You look at these wearable devices, and everything that you get, every number you get on your watch is just a baseline, or as a number looking back on the history, whether it's 6 weeks, 6 months, or 6 years of wearing that watch. Same thing that our blood tells us. I apologize, Doc, go right ahead.
No, well, I guess two things it leads into is that one of the things that we have to, I think, as a subset of what we're talking about, that concept of overreaching versus overtraining.
Yes.
I confess enough back to the old matchbook theory of training. I burned too many matches on this one,
Sure.
So with that, all of a sudden I'm overtrained. I can recover from that if I identify it. I go out of my way to overdo it. But for far too many people, the problem is, oh, I had a bad workout. And it's not that I'm overreached. They're thinking I didn't work hard enough. Yep. I've got to go work harder next time. And it's like, no. If anything, you need to watch and see, do a normal workout. If it's just as bad, we may have to back off. It's not this beautiful linear curve that, every time I go in, I'm going to be 2% better coming out. Some days we're 1% down. Some days we're 3% up. The net needs to be that way.
Yes.
And the other one is that the concept, we focused a little on the heart rate, and I know I put my stuff out on the thoughts on wearable sweat monitor or real-time glucose monitoring. One of the ones I think may be a little bit of a game changer, especially I think for our athletes training, is, and this reflects a lot of biases because this hits the part of physiology I play in all the time. But I think these wearable lactate monitors, real-time sweat lactate, is going to be an interesting tool. Because now I can hone in on not necessarily what I'm losing fluid-wise, what I'm doing, but what my actual, am I staying aerobic, or am I starting to reach that anaerobic threshold, or am I getting to where I'm basically crossing, I should say, I'm hitting my lactate threshold, then I'm starting to hit my anaerobic threshold. That you may be able to mark exactly where you are on your performance. So one, if my goal is not to get to where I'm ever generating lactate, I'm in full recovery, I'm staying aerobic, I can mark that piece. But the other one is we may have people that are able to start quantifying, I'm 8 minutes into a significant training load, where am I at from a lactate standpoint? And they may be able to actually use a marker of don't care what heart rate is anymore to some degree. My lactate hits 6, I'm done. You know what I mean? That we may be able to look at correlating that a little bit better of what your actual oxygen debt is. Those have some potential.
So,
And I know at least for
but
the
how would that work, Doc? If somebody becomes slightly or even significantly dehydrated, the cell's carrying less oxygen per cell,
right.
would that not put them into a quote unquote, according to the monitor, a lactate? They kind of
They
cross
can
that threshold.
actually, what they're actually going to do, and let me qualify, it is going to be tied to volume status.
Okay.
But I mean, if I'm too dry, I'm not going to be delivering enough oxygen. I'm going to have some degree of increased lactate production just because I've got local anaerobic, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense.
But with this, they can quantify that pretty well to affect, your volume status, because they can actually, the at least the one device I've looked at, it's paying attention to what the sweat concentration is. So it has basically, it's almost auto-correcting, if you will. You're
That's what I was
making
wondering.
less sweat or making more sweat, it will adjust because it's basically just taking that lactate, then doing a second test on it, but it has some idea what the percentage is.
And we want the listeners to understand when you build more muscle, most people forget, and I'm not saying this to be condescending at all. Most people forget that fat does not burn calories. Muscles burn calories. So we all want to get leaner and stronger, but then that puts a bigger demand on our calories. Our sweat rate goes up because of the higher muscle contraction. And every time a muscle contracts, it depletes or essentially devours electrolytes.
Yep.
So you see where this becomes a vicious cycle. Over here, people are talking about, hey, I want to improve my lactate tolerance. I want to work on my sprint speed. And yet they're over here dehydrated before they even get started.
Yep.
It skews all the numbers going the other direction. So I want to make sure we clarify that. That's
No.
why with our performance report card, and I want to publicly thank you, Doc, for all your input. Our programming department our report card is scraping data from Garmin, and that Garmin data is being influenced by when you weigh yourself in the morning and you weigh yourself in the evening. Are we hydrated? Is your body weight in the morning over morning elevated? If so, that's inflammation from either food and or exercise. So now we got to go look at your activity schedule from the last 5-7 days, to Doc's point. Then we factor all of that in regards to what adjustments do we need to make. Now, we shouldn't make assumptions. We all know the joke associated with that. But if you've had a good, let's call it a 7-day block, and you nailed your calories, well, now the next week gets even better because, like Doc said, you could kind of squeak by. We're designed to survive. That's not thriving, but that's surviving. You could plod your way through 7 days being calorically in a huge hole. Doc, I heard this comment earlier this week. I thought it was pretty cool. All athletes want velocity. Velocity is fueled by power. Power is driven by calories.
Yep.
And so you go back to what you were just saying, a wearable device is only going to give you one component. That's why we use CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, sweat patches, heart rate monitors. We are looking at these type of blood lactate that Doc is talking about, but you got to remember, it's still in its beta testing phases.
Those are early.
Yes. But thanks to having Doc on our side, our programming department is already working on when those become public. We take the data, for those of you that run the Garmin Connect, when you guys are looking at your phone, we're scraping that data off of the servers with your permission. When we pick a client up, we don't go just scrape data. We ask your permission. We have you sign a document. And then what we do is we pull the Garmin into the Bionix, and we pull that into the CGM numbers, and then eventually blood lactate.
Yep. And
the bigger picture is Complete Med Solutions is we'd like to have your blood profile every 3, preferably 3, but we'll take 4 months if that's what worked logistically, because the blueprint of where your blood is versus where it was and where we want it to go is a byproduct of food, sleep, and load. Load would be personal, professional, financial, and then we get into the athletic. So, and some people, and I think if you've been following us for any period of time, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. No, it's not. When you turn your ignition in your car, how many pieces are involved with that thing just cranking up and you're moving down the road until it doesn't one morning and when you go out to your car. So, and it's just like a mechanic, right? You tell your car's not cranking, they take it down, they start doing diagnostic. On the screen right here, Dr. Branney is the master of diagnostics when it comes to the human. Because like I told you, everything that we have in our performance report card is because of these conversations that we've had. And that's why I wanted to make sure that we got you on here, Doc.
Oh, my pleasure.
Do we have time for one more question?
I was just going to say, Dan, I would really like to see, because I could see you had some questions here. We got started right at an hour ago. So yeah, we've got a good 10 minutes. So feel free, brother.
This one is, and stop me if you guys already talked about this.
No worries. Go for it.
I have a feeling maybe you haven't, but for us male athletes getting older, I'm going to be this question's a little selfish, right? But I think this will hit home to a lot of people, especially our vet riders. But testosterone, right? Yep. How important is it to have good testosterone levels? And you see all these ads about testosterone treatment and, everybody should have it. Can you kind of explain the whole testosterone thing and what that does for a male to increase performance or just feeling better, I guess?
And you hit a couple things that I think are really important. Is that one, athletically, it's huge in terms of my ability to generate new muscle mass, to get the most out of the training I'm doing. Testosterone's massive. The other one is it is quite well tied into our well-being. We function better as adult males with an adequate level of testosterone. We're not quite as bad as buffalo. Most of the time when they go old and go sterile, they go crazy. But that's kind of the biologic extreme, if we will, of the psychological component of having adequate testosterone. The other flip side of that is supplemental testosterone can be harmful for some individuals. I'll throw out right now, I've got a very low testosterone. I would love to be on supplementation. Problem with me is that my hematocrit, or the concentration of red blood cells within my blood, gets excessively high, which can be one of the side effects of testosterone. So I can't tolerate it. But what I would strongly suggest is that if someone, especially is doing an athletic is competitive athletically, and especially if that is important enough to them to look at the side effects of the testosterone with somebody and say, are these worth it for me to try? And then if they have a low testosterone, to do testosterone supplementation back up into normal levels, make certain there's no side effects, you will have a better athletic and a better overall performance. And I think even on day-to-day life, you would feel better. There's no doubt.
And a lot of these companies, when they tell you that you take the test, right, for low testosterone, they say you're low, you need a supplement. Right. Are they providing you the details like you had alluded to, like yourself, you just can't take it? Would the average person know that, or are they just being pushed testosterone?
That's a bell curve. And to be honest, there's certainly no doubt that is financially lucrative enough. Remember, we can't do it as a tablet. Your liver just chews that stuff up on first pass metabolism. So there's no easy way to do it. So now I've got a clinic appointment for an injectable. There's a financial benefit to those companies doing that. And so certainly there's probably some people with pressure there. But I think if anyone was to approach this of, I'm considering this, what are the side effects and how would we test for those and monitor those? You could watch my hematocrit go right up when I started and go right down when I stopped. It's reasonably easy. It's a blood test, and a very simple blood test in that regard. But it's also one that I think needs to be looked at.
Doc, what would you say percentage-wise, like Dan's saying, that's the new thing right now. There's all these men's, fertility or whatever they're calling them. What, in your experience, again, just strictly from experience, if we took a sample group of 1,000 people, what percentage of those would probably have an adverse reaction to synthetic HGH?
Well, not HGH, for testosterone here at this point.
Testosterone, excuse me.
I'm sorry. A little different. That's okay. Probably not that many.
Okay.
And I'm going to put it, it's probably pushing close to single digits,
Okay.
probably under 20% for sure. So it's a very viable alternative.
But it's the
And I
first time
think
I've ever heard somebody say it, is why I'm interrupting you.
yeah, no, I
Dan asked
think,
a question that I thought was pretty benign. I've never heard somebody say that their red blood cell count, their RBC, that hematocrit level would
yeah,
actually go up.
oh
I've
yeah.
never heard that before.
No, and the problem gets if as it goes up, viscosity is directly proportional to your blood cell count,
Yeah.
increases your stroke risk. If it gets too sluggish, that's usually like in the 60s. But normal, say, is 45. I got to like 58. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
It's like, okay,
You're right
um,
there.
yeah, it's not worth the risk to continue. And sorry for personal stuff thrown out there, but
No,
with
it's great. I think it, Doc,
phenomenal.
don't apologize at all. That's what our followers love, is the authenticity, no bullshit, no
Yep.
games. We don't play political correctness. We're not here to offend anybody. We don't
Right.
stand on one or the other. We just state it the way it is. That's why
Now,
I
and
always love working with you. So please continue to be curt.
that's all right. And then the flip side of this is if I look at it solely from, I know WADA is not a big issue, but when you start looking at competition,
Yep.
if I've got a documented low testosterone, I can recover it to within normal range by medication. That's an accepted medication. It's not an issue there. So in some sense, it's a lot of bang for the buck, I think, particularly for the elderly athlete. Now, downside is growth hormone, much more difficult to map out.
Mhm.
Growth hormone levels, as complex as the testosterone system is within the body, growth hormone even a little more difficult. And so very unlikely to be able to get into a growth hormone supplementation range. A lot of that is just doing what you can to maximize your own body's, generation and use of growth hormone, which sadly means as much REM sleep as you can get. So as a vet rider or a parent or someone with a complex multi-job lifestyle,
Dan.
that makes that a little bit more difficult.
Absolutely.
And but the downside, the good news, we don't get into the problems. Most of the problems athletically for growth hormone and testosterone mismatch are mostly big strength athletes.
Okay.
They get their muscle out in front. Rob and I had this discussion before. They get their muscle out in front of their connective. Growth hormone's great for connective tissue, great for recovery. But if I'm mismatched and I'm training my muscles harder than I'm building their supportive structure, that's where we can get into pec tears, bicep tears. The muscle power being generated, muscle is just greater than the ability of the connective tissue to support it.
It's crazy.
Last question regarding
Yep.
testosterone. I would assume that a lot of people have no clue that their testosterone is low. They
Yep.
just don't know. At what age would you recommend a male to get his testosterone checked?
I don't know that this is my personal, because I don't know off the top of my head. I'll try and look to see if there's a formal recommendation. If I had an athlete, they should do it in their 30s, probably low 30s.
Okay.
'Cause that's where we might first start to see. The other one is that side effects, if you're just a little bit low rather than drastically low, you could get a lower dose, lower side effect risk. You know what I mean? If all I'm trying to do is recover and remain within a normal range, the earlier that's identified, the better. And so rather than waiting to, wow, my performance is really falling off, I'm depressed, I may be gaining a little weight, I would recommend that probably somewhere in their 30s, especially if someone's active. And especially if they're planning on, my athletic aspirations require a high level performance.
And I think what's so powerful about that closing comment, Doc, is that's why I love this show. As we said earlier, we have a lot of listeners who have children and even grandchildren. And if we can just get this type of knowledge in front of them, because for those of you that ride moto, whenever and Dan and I have spoken about this on the show as well, Doc, in a perfect world for me, I would be able to get with a parent that has a young athlete, even as early as on a 65, just get them to understand the importance of not overdoing it.
Yeah.
And then they get into that mid-bike class. Well, I'm stuck in a dichotomy because the parents think that they're too young to really learn about nutrition and anything relevant to physiology. They think that's too advanced for the little one. By the time they jump to a big bike, the speed and the velocity, they hit the ground enough times. Now they've got a bunch of broken bones. They go, oh, I guess we now need to start. Well, unfortunately, you're 3 years too late. And that's really the whole genesis behind why I wanted to get you on here. Was it's difficult for us to try to get the message across when we're dealing with a spectrum that it's either perceived as too early or perceived as too late. And that's why I really appreciate you coming on. And like we said earlier, this is not a one and done. We will be bringing Dr. Briny back based on his schedule. Doc, on behalf of Toolman Dan and I, we cannot thank you enough. And for all of our listeners, we can't thank you enough for the knowledge. And we said it earlier, I'm going to reiterate it here. If you have any questions for Doc, please send it to us. contact@coachrobb.com. Jennifer will get him over to me. I'll get him over to Doc. We will email you directly back, but what we may do is have the next show be kind of ask the Doc, if you will. So Doc, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time. And man, I don't know how you're keeping up with your schedule the way it is. I look at that roster of accomplishments and things you're engaged in. So don't smoke yourself. Okay. We need you.
I won't. All
right, Doc.
in the envelope, but appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doc.